In a town where broken things got tossed in the snow and forgotten, she came limping out of nowhere, dragging one leg, carrying a rusted toolbox, and fixing machines with hands steadier than any man alive. Ellie Vance didn't have much, just a limp, a brain full of blueprints, and a past full of reasons not to trust anyone. But when the last mill in New Trenton groaned to a halt in the dead of winter, it wasn't the strong who saved the town. It was the girl everyone had already dismissed. They laughed at her until the machines stopped. Then they watched her. And when she climbed that frozen scaffold with a wrench in one hand and frostbite in the other, well, no one laughed after that. Would you have trusted a crippled girl to fix the one thing standing between your town and starvation? Or would you have stepped aside and let her do what no one else dared? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Some stories deserve to be carried by more than just gears and steel. The first breath of true winter had clenched New Trenton, Kansas, in its fist, and the sky hung low and gray as a stained sheet of tin. Life in the small prairie town, always a precarious dance with the elements, now huddled around the rhythmic pulse of the Pendleton flour mill. Its stone walls, frosted white, were the town's bulwark against starvation. Its chuffing steam engine, the communal heartbeat. When the mill ran, New Trenton breathed. When it faltered, a chill deeper than any blizzard settled in. Arthur Pendleton, owner and reluctant patriarch of this fragile ecosystem, stood at his office window, staring out at the bleak landscape. He was a man hewn from the same stubborn Kansas soil he profited from, practical to a fault, deeply conservative in his ways, his heart walled off since the day the mill, his father's legacy and his own life's work, had betrayed him by taking Clara, his wife, a woman whose brilliance with gears and steam had been a quiet marvel, had tried to warn him about a flaw in the new turbine linkage. An engineer, they'd called her, though few in New Trenton had understood what that meant for a woman. He, caught in the rush of harvest season, had listened with half an ear, dismissed her concerns as feminine fussing over perfectly sound machinery. The memory of the catastrophic failure, the shriek of tortured metal, Clara's name caught in his throat. It was a private winter he carried inside him. Year after relentless year, on the wind-scoured edge of town, where New Trenton frayed into broken prairie and forgotten things, lived Ellie Vance. She was a whisper in the town's louder narrative, a solitary figure known more for the slight, dragging hitch in her left leg, legacy of a childhood fever, than for the quick, capable hands that could coax life back into almost any broken mechanism. Folks called her patch of land the scrap heap, for it was there, amongst discarded plows, broken water pumps, and the ghosts of failed inventions, that Ellie eked out a meager existence. She repaired what others threw away, her small shack often warmed by the glow of her forge, or the smell of hot oil and soldering flux. The limp made her an easy target for thoughtless taunts from idle youths, and the older townsfolk mostly looked right through her, a piece of human detritus best ignored. She knew machines, though her father, a gifted mechanic himself, had taught her their language before a seemingly insignificant flaw in a threshing machine's governor had silenced him forever. That understanding, that shared grief over the treachery of flawed iron, was a quiet bond between her and the memory of Arthur Pendleton's wife. Though Ellie had been but a child when Clara died, the trouble at the mill started on a Monday, with a cough from the main grinding assembly. Then a jarring screech that echoed through the frozen town like a death rattle. Silence followed, vast and terrifying. The heart had stopped. Arthur was down on the mill floor in an instant. His foreman, Big Gus, already surrounded by a worried knot of millwrights. For 2 days, they wrestled with the massive stone grinders, their efforts growing increasingly desperate. They checked every belt, every gear, every steam valve. They brought in the blacksmith, then the retired master mechanic from Hayes City. Nothing. The silence stretched, and with it, the town's collective anxiety. No flour meant no bread, no trade, no income. Winter, already a formidable adversary, began to look like an executioner. Ellie, on her way back from delivering a mended harness to a farmer just outside town, had paused near the silent mill. She often did her quiet mending work for townsfolk under the sprawling oak near the mill's less-used side entrance, the rhythmic sounds usually a comfort. Now, the silence drew her. She wasn't prying, just listening to the machine's stillness, a stillness that felt like pain. She could see the frantic activity through a grimy window, hear the frustrated shouts. The clang of tools dropped in anger. She understood that kind of frustration. She knew the stubborn sulk of a machine that refused to yield. On the third morning, the air in the mill was thick with despair and the metallic scent of failure. Arthur Pendleton's face was a mask of gray exhaustion. His neatly combed hair was disheveled, his usual starched collar undone. He'd just sent word to Wichita for a specialized engineer, a man who might not arrive for a week, if the worsening weather even allowed it. A week the town couldn't afford. A hesitant knock came at the side door of the milling floor. One of the younger lads opened it to find Ellie Vance standing there, a worn satchel of tools in her hand, snowflakes melting on her threadbare shawl. Her limp seemed more pronounced in the biting cold. "Mr. Pendleton," she said, her voice quiet but clear, addressing his back as he stared bleakly at the inert machinery. "Beggin' your pardon, sir, I think I might know what's wrong with your grinder." A ripple of disbelief, then outright snickers, went through the assembled men. Big Gus guffawed. "Well, now I've heard everything. The scrap girl thinks she can fix what grown men, trained men, couldn't." Arthur turned slowly, his eyes, bloodshot and weary, fixing on Ellie. He saw a wisp of a girl, disabled, an outcast. His mind flashed to Clara, her brilliant insights dismissed. The irony wasn't lost on him, but grief and ingrained prejudice were powerful wardens. "This is no place for you, girl," he said, his voice flat. "We don't need children underfoot playing with men's tools." Ellie flushed, but her gaze didn't waver. "My father, he taught me machines, sir. Sometimes it's a small thing, overlooked. Like a whisper you don't quite hear." Her words, "a small thing, overlooked," echoed in the hollow chambers of Arthur's memory. Clara had said something similar about the turbine. He looked at the massive, silent grinder, a monument to his current failure. He looked at the desperate faces of his men. He looked back at Ellie, at the quiet confidence in her steady blue eyes, a startling contrast to her otherwise fragile appearance. What did he have to lose? More hours of fruitless labor. His pride was already in tatters. "All right, Vance," he said, the name tasting foreign on his tongue. The snickers died abruptly. "You think you can do what these men can't? Show us." He waved a hand towards the silent behemoth. "But don't expect payment for breaking it further." A tense silence descended as Ellie, ignoring the stairs, moved towards the grinder. She didn't rush. She walked around it slowly, her good hand trailing lightly over the cold iron casing. As if greeting an old, ailing friend, she laid her satchel down, selected a few unconventional tools, a long, slender listening rod, a series of finely wrought wrenches her father had made. She didn't just look. She listened, placing the rod against different points, her head cocked. She hummed softly, a tuneless sound, as if coaxing the machine's secrets out. The millwrights exchanged bewildered, scornful glances. Arthur watched, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. For 20 minutes, she worked, her movements precise, economical. She tightened a nut here, adjusted a casing there, her small hands surprisingly strong. Then, she tapped a specific point on a secondary drive shaft housing. a place no one else had paid much mind. "There," she murmured, more to herself than anyone. "It's binding. Just a fraction, but enough to throw the balance under load." She selected a small, custom-ground shim from her kit, deftly loosened a retaining bolt, slipped the shim into place, and retightened it with careful, measured torque. She stepped back. "Try it now, Mr. Pendleton," she said quietly, gently at first. Big Gus looked at Arthur, who gave a curt nod. With a collective held breath, the foreman engaged the steam clutch. A hiss, a groan, then a hesitant rumble. The massive grinding stones began to turn, slowly, then faster, settling into their familiar, rhythmic song. The silence was broken. The heart of New Trenton was beating again. A stunned quiet filled the mill floor, quickly followed by a disbelieving cheer from the workers. They crowded around Ellie, patting her on the back, their earlier scorn forgotten in the wave of relief. Ellie, unused to such attention, simply flushed and looked at her worn boots. Arthur Pendleton walked over to her, his expression still stern, though the deep lines of worry around his eyes had softened almost imperceptibly. He looked from Ellie to the smoothly running grinder and back again. The entire ordeal, from her quiet request to the machine's resurrection, had taken just under half an hour. He cleared his throat. The men fell silent, waiting for his verdict. "Not bad, Vance," he said, his voice gruff, ceding no more than necessary. "Not bad at all." He paused, his gaze sharp. "But the real question is, can you do it again next time?" It wasn't praise. Not exactly. It was a challenge, a reluctant acknowledgement, and perhaps, just perhaps, the faintest crack in the wall around Arthur Pendleton's carefully guarded heart. For Ellie, who had expected nothing more than a curt dismissal even in success, it was the first hesitant note of a new, unfamiliar tune. The mill floor still buzzed with the men's grudging admissions and Arthur Pendleton's terse challenge when Ellie Vance appeared the next morning, punctual as the winter sun's first weak rays. Arthur found her by the side door, her worn satchel at her feet, her gaze fixed on the now steadily thrumming machinery. "So, you decided to come back," he stated, his voice carefully neutral. It wasn't a question. Ellie met his gaze. "You said to Mr. Pendleton, if I could do it again." "I did," he conceded. "The storeroom at the back, next to the old cooperage. It's dry, mostly. Bedding's your own concern. Wages are $3 a week. Temporary. You answer to Big Gus, but you don't touch anything major without my direct say-so. And any damages you cause beyond reasonable wear will come out of that $3. Understood." His terms were harsh, almost daring her to refuse. "Understood, sir," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. There was no gratitude, no fear, just acceptance. It unsettled him more than an argument would have. So began Ellie's tenure. The storeroom was indeed mostly dry, and colder than a well-digger's resolve. But she made it her own with a quiet efficiency, a thick layer of sacking over the draftiest cracks, her bedroll in the most sheltered corner. Her days were spent in the belly of the mill, a silent, observant presence. She didn't so much impose her will on the machinery as listen to it, coax it. The old mill, a patchwork of decades of repairs and improvisations, was a chorus of groans, sighs, and a rhythmic clatter. To Ellie, each sound was a symptom, a story. Around her neck, the small brass cog, her father's last touch, lay cool against her skin beneath her collar. Her father's wrench, heavy and familiar, became an extension of her arm. With it, she performed miracles of adjustment that baffled the other millwrights. She'd stand for long minutes beside a struggling belt-driven sorter, her eyes closed, her head tilted, the listening rod held like a diviner's branch against its iron frame. Then, with a sigh as soft as escaping steam, she'd make a fractional turn of a tensioning bolt, or add a paper-thin shim to a bearing cap, and the machine would settle into a smoother, more harmonious song. "It's like she's witchin' 'em." Young Timms, one of the baggers, whispered to his mate after Ellie had silenced a persistent squeal in the grain elevator that had defied their efforts for a week. The older hands were less charitable. Henderson, a burly, red-faced mechanic whose solutions usually involved a larger hammer, found Ellie's subtle methods an affront. One afternoon, the main conveyor for flour sacks began to jerk and slip, threatening to send 100-pound bags tumbling. "Needs a new belt." "Gus," Henderson bellowed at the foreman, after wrestling with the tensioner to no avail. This one stretched beyond redemption. Big Gus, a man whose skepticism about Ellie was slowly being eroded by results, looked over at where Ellie was quietly watching. "What do you reckon?" "Vance." Ellie approached, her limp a familiar counterpoint to the mill's rhythm. "The belt has some wear. Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice barely audible above the machinery. "But I think the drive pulley might be misaligned. See how the edge frays unevenly." She pointed to a subtle wear pattern. Henderson snorted. "Alignment. It's worn, girl. Plain as the nose on your face. You stick to your nuts and bolts. This needs replacing. Let her try." "Henderson," Arthur Pendleton's voice cut in. Unexpectedly, he'd been observing from the walkway above. "Your method clearly isn't bearing fruit." Henderson's face purpled, but he stepped back, muttering about pampered pets and wasting good time. Ellie, seemingly oblivious, knelt by the drive mechanism. Using her father's wrench and a set of feeler gauges she'd crafted herself from clock springs, she made minute adjustments to the pulley's set screws. The tension was palpable. After a few moments, she nodded to Big Gus. "Try it now, please." With a skeptical grunt, Gus engaged the conveyor. It moved smoothly, powerfully, the sacks gliding along without a hint of their earlier stutter. Henderson stared, then spat on the floor and stalked off. Big Gus ran a hand over his balding head. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. Then louder. "Good work, Vance." Sharp eyes. He didn't smile. But for Big Gus, it was high praise. Young Gus Carmichael, the new hand, however, was all smiles and admiration. "That was truly something, Miss Vance," he'd say, sidling up to her as she cleaned her tools. "I swear, you talk to these machines. My pa, he was a farmer, never could get the hang of anything more complicated than a hand plow. He'd linger, watching her sketch a gear assembly on a piece of scrap lumber. His questions casual. What's that little drawing for, then? Just figuring things out. Ellie, starved for simple kindness, would sometimes explain a principle of mechanics, the flow of force, the balance of tolerances. She didn't notice how young Gus's gaze would sharpen on her drawings, how he'd commit her quick, insightful diagrams to memory, his affable expression a carefully constructed mask. Once, while helping her near the bolting reels, he fumbled a grease can, causing a sticky mess that gummed up a crucial sifting screen. His apologies were profuse. Clumsy oaf. "That's me, Miss Vance. So sorry to cause you more trouble." Ellie spent an hour meticulously cleaning and recalibrating the delicate screens, while young Gus watched with an expression of deep contrition that, had she been less focused, she might have found a shade too polished. Arthur Pendleton found his steps leading him past Ellie's work areas more often than strictly necessary. He'd tell himself he was merely ensuring his temporary assistance wasn't about to cause another expensive breakdown. But he found himself lingering, watching her hands, small, yet so sure, as they moved over the iron and steel. He saw the faint sheen of oil that always seemed to cling to her, the smudge of grease on her cheekbone she was perpetually unaware of. He saw the quiet determination in her eyes, the absolute absorption as she diagnosed a machine's ailment. It reminded him so acutely of Clara, her similar intensity, her almost reverent touch with anything mechanical, that it was like a fresh twist of the knife in an old wound. He'd been particularly concerned about the main drive system after a night of freezing rain. He'd expected to find the belts coated in ice, the whole north wall of the mill a frozen cascade. But when he'd arrived just before dawn, lantern in hand, he'd found Ellie already there, a small, bundled figure high on a ladder. The story of that night, her quiet diligence, the greased canvas, and her meticulous, handwritten notes in that little leather-bound book, a book that looked eerily like one Clara had cherished, replayed in his mind. He hadn't spoken to her then, just watched from the shadows, a strange mixture of consternation and an unfamiliar warmth spreading through him. A few days after that icy night, he found her in the cavernous basement where the main water turbine fed its power upwards. The air was damp, echoing with the roar of the water and the deep thrum of the massive gears. She was examining a series of governor weights, her brow furrowed. "Problema, Vance?" he asked, his voice louder than intended to overcome the din. She started, not having heard him approach. "Mr. Pendleton." "No, sir, not a problem yet. Just listening." She gestured to the weights. "There's a slight imbalance. I think not enough to cause trouble now. But with the spring thaws, when the river runs higher and faster, it might put undue strain on the primary shaft." He looked at the governors. They seemed fine to him, the same as they'd been for 20 years. "They've always run that way." "Yes, sir," Ellie said softly. "But always isn't the same as right. My father used to say that even the strongest iron has a memory for stress. It remembers every imbalance, every strain, until one day it remembers too much." She touched the little brass cog at her throat. "A small flaw. Sir, that's all it takes." Her words, so reminiscent of Clara's unheeded warnings, struck him with the force of a physical blow. He saw not the dim, roaring basement of his mill, but another time, another beloved face, earnest and worried, trying to make him understand. He looked at Ellie, truly looked at her, and saw beyond the limp, the patched clothes, the smudge of grease. He saw an intelligence, a profound and intuitive understanding that shamed his own long years of experience. He saw a quiet strength that had weathered scorn and isolation, and a dedication that asked for nothing in return. "See to it, then, Vance," he said, his voice hoarse. "If you think it needs attention, see to it." He turned and left abruptly, the roar of the turbine suddenly deafening, unable to face the echoes she had awakened within him. He was beginning to understand that Ellie Vance wasn't just changing oil and tightening bolts. She was slowly, painstakingly, realigning the very heart of his mill, and perhaps his own frozen, carefully guarded world. The words Arthur Pendleton had spoken in the roaring basement of the mill, "See to it then, Vance. If you think it needs attention, see to it," had marked a subtle shift, a grudging cession of trust that was as significant, in its own way, as the first thaw of a Kansas spring. Ellie, for her part, had simply nodded and done just that, her quiet competence a steadying rhythm in the often chaotic pulse of the Pendleton flour mill. The governor weights on the main turbine were rebalanced with painstaking precision, and the mill, almost imperceptibly at first, seemed to breathe a little easier. The fragile peace, however, was as ephemeral as an early frost on a late autumn morning. It was shattered by the arrival of a gleaming black buggy, pulled by a pair of matched bays that looked far too sleek for the muddy streets of New Trenton. From it emerged Cal Munro, owner of the Munro Consolidated Mills in Junction City, Arthur Pendleton's chief competitor, and a man whose ambition was as vast and unforgiving as the prairie itself. Munro was a big man, florid-faced and loud, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the workaday attire of New Trenton. He found Arthur in his office, the scent of his bay rum and self-importance preceding him. "Pendleton," Munro boomed, foregoing any pleasantries. Heard you were having a bit of mechanical difficulty. Thought I'd offer my commiserations." His smile was all teeth. Holding no warmth, Arthur rose, his expression carefully neutral, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Monroe, unexpected. The mill is running fine. Is it now?" Monroe's gaze drifted out the window, towards the mill floor. His eyes narrowed as he caught sight of Ellie, her slight frame bent over a troublesome conveyor clutch. "Heard you'd hired yourself a new master mechanic. Some little crippled girl from the scrap heap, they say." He chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Getting desperate in your old age. Pendleton, relying on charity cases and female intuition to keep this old relic of yours creaking along." The insult, aimed as much at Arthur's past tragedy with Clara as at his present reliance on Ellie, was deliberate and cruel. Arthur's hands clenched at his sides. "Ellie Vance is a capable worker. Monroe, more capable than some I could name who draw a man's wage for half the skill. Now, if your business here is concluded." Monroe's smile widened. "Just a friendly visit. Pendleton, always like to see how the competition is faring." He cast another dismissive glance towards Ellie. "Wouldn't want your whole operation to grind to a halt because a girl breaks a nail. Or a gear." With a final, patronizing nod, he was gone, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with unspoken animosity. It started subtly. A week later, a vital drive belt, one Ellie had inspected and found sound just days before, snapped clean through, its edges suspiciously frayed, as if nicked by a sharp blade. Then, a series of roller bearings on a sifting machine seized up, not from lack of lubrication, but from oil that Ellie, examining it closely, found to be gritty, contaminated with fine sand. "Mr. Pendleton," she'd said, holding up a vial of the tainted oil, "this isn't normal wear. Someone put this grit in here." Arthur had frowned, his skepticism warring with a growing unease. "Machines get old. Vents. Oil gets dirty. Are you sure you're not imagining things?" His reluctance to believe stemmed partly from a deep-seated aversion to conspiracy, partly from the uncomfortable echo of Clara's unheeded warnings. Accusations were easy. Proof was hard. But Ellie persisted, her observations meticulous. A critical set screw on a grain auger worked itself loose overnight, despite her having tightened and checked it herself. A bundle of spare electrical wiring, carefully stored, was found inexplicably cut into short, useless lengths. Each incident, taken alone, might have been accidental. Together, they painted a more sinister picture. "The sounds are wrong. Mr. Pendleton," she insisted one evening, after a day spent wrestling with a series of minor, nagging malfunctions. "It's like someone's deliberately untuning the mill." Little by little, her quiet conviction began to penetrate Arthur's reserve. He remembered Monroe's sneering visit, the veiled threats. He started observing his men more closely, the atmosphere on the mill floor growing heavy with unspoken suspicion. The proof Ellie needed came during one of her late-night vigils. She often walked the silent mill after hours, listening, sensing, her connection to the machinery most acute when the human clamor was stilled. She'd been particularly concerned about a complex planetary gear assembly she'd redesigned for the fine flower bolter, a modification that had significantly improved its efficiency. Something about its recent performance felt off. Armed with her lantern and her father's wrench, she meticulously began to dismantle the access panel. What she found made her blood run cold. One of the key cogs, a small, intricately toothed wheel she herself had machined from hardened steel, was not her own. This one was brass, like the memento around her neck, but crudely cast, its teeth poorly formed, a hairline fracture already visible near its hub. It was a near-perfect visual copy, but structurally flawed, designed to fail, and to fail catastrophically. Only someone with intimate knowledge of her design and access to the mill's workshop, could have made and installed such a counterfeit? The faint, cackling click it made under pressure wasn't from the machine. It was the sound of betrayal. Her mind immediately went to young Gus Carmichael, his ingratiating smiles, his overly keen interest in her diagrams, his convenient presence near machinery just before it developed a new quirk. The accidental grease spill. It all clicked into place with a sickening lurch. For the next 2 days, Ellie watched him, her movements quiet, her gaze missing nothing. She observed his furtive glances, the way he lingered near her workbench when she was called away. Then, late one afternoon, as the shift was ending, she saw him slip away from the main group of departing workers and head towards the deserted eastern loading dock. Keeping to the shadows, Ellie followed. She saw him pull a small, flat object from his pocket, a compact, modern camera, the kind that could capture an image in an instant. He was photographing a page from her private notebook, one she'd inadvertently left open, detailing a new linkage she was devising for the grain hopper. The click of its shutter, though faint, was as damning as a gunshot in the quiet evening. He was stealing her work, her thoughts, undoubtedly for Cal Monroe. Before she could decide how to confront him or warn Arthur, a deafening roar ripped through the mill from the direction of the main grinding floor. It was followed by a sickening metallic shriek and the smell of burning oil and superheated steam. A minor explosion, but in a flour mill, any spark was a potential inferno. Men were shouting, running. Arthur was already on the scene, bellowing for water buckets, his face grim. A cloud of acrid smoke billowed from the casing of No. 2 grinder. Flames licked at a nearby stack of jute sacks. Shaft bearing must have seized and overheated. Big Gus yelled over the din. Young Miller. He was checking the feed. He's in there. Through the smoke, Ellie saw a terrifying sight. A young apprentice, barely a man, was trapped, his leg pinned by a heavy, dislodged section of the grinder's feeder chute. The heat was intense, the flames growing. Arthur, his coat sleeve already singed, was trying to reach him, but a falling timber, burning at one end, struck his shoulder, sending him stumbling back with a cry of pain. Without a second thought, Ellie sprinted towards the emergency hoist she'd quietly installed near the heavy machinery access bay just weeks before. A system of ropes and pulleys of her own design, strong enough to lift twice a man's weight. Operated by a simple hand crank, she'd argued for its necessity, citing safety, but had been met with indulgent smiles. Now, no one was smiling. Grab the crank. Timms, Henderson, guide the hook, she commanded, her voice cutting through the panic with an authority no one questioned. Working with desperate speed, they maneuvered the hoist. Ellie, ignoring the smoke that stung her eyes and the heat that blistered her skin, darted into the dangerous space, secured the harness around the terrified apprentice, and gave the signal. The hoist creaked, held, then slowly, agonizingly, lifted the boy clear just as the burning sacks ignited with a whoosh. They dragged him out, coughing and soot-covered, but alive. Arthur, clutching his injured shoulder, watched Ellie as she knelt beside the apprentice, checking his injuries with a calm competence that belied the chaos around them. The fire was quickly being brought under control by the bucket brigade. Later, when the immediate danger had passed and the acrid smell of burnt grain and doused flames hung heavy in the air, Arthur Pendleton found Ellie leaning against a wall, her face smudged with soot, her hands trembling slightly. He walked over to her, his own face pale beneath the grime, his arm now roughly bandaged. He looked at the damaged grinder, at the soot-stained walls, at the young apprentice being helped away. Then he looked at Ellie. The taunts of Cal Monroe, his own stubborn skepticism, the years of guarded grief, all seemed to fall away in that moment, leaving only a raw, undeniable truth. "Vance," he said, his voice hoarse, heavy with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. He paused, searching for words. Ellie. It was the first time he'd used her given name. You are the only one, he said, his gaze intense, holding hers. The only one who knows what's really going on in this place. The only one who truly keeps it running. It wasn't just about machines anymore. It was about trust, earned in the face of fire and treachery. It was about seeing, finally, the true measure of the girl from the scrap heap. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The air in Pendleton's office still tasted of smoke and fear when Arthur, his injured shoulder bound tightly, laid out the damning evidence before Big Gus and a hastily assembled, grim-faced group of senior millwrights and town elders. The counterfeit cog. The stolen designs Ellie had witnessed young Gus photographing. The escalating pattern of sabotage. It all pointed one way. Cal Munro, young Gus Carmichael, it was quickly discovered, had vanished, his few belongings gone from his rented room, leaving only the faint scent of betrayal and cheap cigar smoke. He used the boy, Arthur stated, his voice flat, devoid of its usual command, replaced by a weary anger, fed him lies, or coin, or both. Munro wants this mill crippled, wants New Trenton starved out so he can pick up the pieces. He looked at the faces around him, seeing doubt flicker in some. Ellie Vance uncovered this. She saved young Miller's life. She's kept this mill running when it had every right to die. The hastily convened town meeting later that day in the drafty, lamplit general store was a storm of its own. Arthur, his arm in a sling, laid out the facts calmly, his words carrying the weight of a man pushed too far. Ellie stood beside him, a silent testament, her presence drawing murmurs from the crowd. Cal Munro, summoned by a rider dispatched with the news of the accident and Arthur's accusations, arrived in a flurry of bluster and righteous indignation. An outrage. Munro boomed, his face flushed a dangerous purple. Pendleton, your mill is falling apart from neglect and mismanagement, and you seek to blame me. For what? For hiring a girl. His lip curled as he looked at Ellie. To do a man's work. Perhaps these accidents are merely the result of her incompetence. That girl, Arthur's voice cut through Munro's tirade, cold as a January wind, has more mechanical sense in her little finger than your entire crew possesses. Munro, and she has the integrity you clearly lack. Young Gus Carmichael was seen photographing her designs. He disappeared right after the explosion. You tell me that's coincidence. The townsfolk erupted. Some voices rose in support of Arthur and Ellie, the parents of young Miller, who owed his life to her quick thinking. Farmers who depended on the mill for their livelihood and had seen its improved running. Ellie's kept us going, one shouted. She knows the mill. But others, swayed by Munro's confident denials or clinging to old prejudices, voiced their doubts. A woman's place ain't in a mill's guts, muttered old Henderson, the disgruntled mechanic. Machines need a man's hand. This is what happens when you upset the natural order. Another, a merchant whose credit lines ran through Junction City, added nervously. Munro's a respected businessman, Arthur. These are serious accusations. The debate raged, fueled by fear and uncertainty. Ellie listened, her face pale but her gaze steady. She'd faced scorn before. This was different. Though, this wasn't just about her. It was about the town's survival, Arthur's honor, and the insidious way doubt could poison a community. As if summoned by the rising human tempest, the wind outside, which had been picking up all afternoon, suddenly shrieked, rattling the store's windows with a savage fury. The temperature, already plummeting, seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Snow, fine and hard as sand, began to drive horizontally, obscuring the world outside in a blinding white curtain, a level 5 blizzard. The kind that prairie veterans spoke of with a grim reverence had descended upon New Trenton with terrifying speed. The arguments inside faltered, overshadowed by the primal roar of the storm. Then, above the wind, came another sound, a deep, shuddering groan from the direction of the mill, followed by a series of violent, rhythmic tremors that vibrated through the floorboards of the general store. Every man who knew the mill, Arthur foremost among them, froze. That was the sound of the main grinder assembly, the heart of everything, tearing itself apart. The mill, Big Gus yelled, already lunging for the door. Arthur, despite his injured shoulder, was right behind him, Ellie at his heels. The concerns of the meeting instantly eclipsed by this new, immediate crisis. They fought their way through the maelstrom to the mill, the wind threatening to rip them from their feet, the snow stinging their faces like needles. Inside, the scene was chaotic. The massive grinder stones were vibrating so violently that the entire structure around them shook. Sparks flew from protesting bearings, and the air was filled with the smell of burning oil and tortured metal. If the assembly failed completely, the town's only source of flour, its lifeline, would be gone. In a blizzard like this, that was a death sentence. Ellie, her senses preternaturally attuned to the machinery's distress, pushed past the panicked millwrights. She didn't need to listen for long. "It's the main hydraulic press," she shouted to Arthur over the din, pointing high above them to the complex system of pipes and pistons that maintained the immense pressure on the grinding stones. A line must have cracked in the cold. It's losing pressure unevenly. That's what's causing the imbalance. Arthur followed her gaze. The upper workings of the press were nearly invisible in the steam and swirling flour dust, accessible only by a narrow, rickety catwalk nearly 30 feet up, slick with condensation, and now, undoubtedly, ice. It's too dangerous. Ellie, no one can get up there in this. If it's not resealed and the pressure equalized, the whole assembly will shatter. Ellie's voice was tight with urgency. She was already shrugging off her thin shawl, her eyes scanning the treacherous climb. "We have to try." "No." Arthur grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong despite his injury. "I won't let you. It's suicide. We'll shut it down." Shutting it down now, with this much imbalance, could be just as catastrophic. Ellie pulled her arm free, her eyes blazing with a fierce light he'd never seen before. "And if we lose the grinder, the town starves. The children starve. Mr. Pendleton," her voice dropped, raw with an old pain, "I am fixing this. Not because you or anyone else believes I can't. Not for praise. But because no one else in this town should ever have to die because of a failing machine. Like my father did. Not while I can stop it." Before he could argue further, she was scrambling onto the first rung of the ladder leading to the catwalk. Her father's wrench was thrust into her belt, the small brass cog at her throat a cold weight against her skin. The climb was terrifying. The wind, finding its way through every crack in the mill's ancient walls, tore at her, threatening to pluck her from her precarious hold. Her injured leg ached with the effort. Each upward movement a struggle against her own body and the elements. Her hands, bare to the cold, were quickly numb, making her grip on the icy rungs treacherous. Below, she could see Arthur's upturned face, a pale blur in the chaos, his expression a mixture of fear and something else. Something that looked like anguished admiration. Reaching the catwalk, she edged her way along the narrow, vibrating platform. The damaged hydraulic line was visible now, a hairline fracture weeping precious fluid. The metal around it coated in frost, working with desperate, fumbling haste, her fingers clumsy with cold. She managed to isolate the leak and apply a temporary patch using a clamp and a strip of reinforced rubber she always carried. Then came the even more delicate task of manually adjusting the pressure equalization valves, trying to coax the shuddering behemoth back into balance. Every tremor of the platform beneath her feet threatened to send her plummeting into the grinding maw below. Time seemed to stop. There was only the roar of the storm, the shriek of the tortured machinery, the burning cold, and her own ragged breathing. Then, slowly, miraculously, the violent shaking began to subside. The terrible groans lessened, the rhythm of the grinders smoothing out into a more stable, if still labored, thrum when Ellie finally climbed back down, her body trembling uncontrollably from cold and exertion, her face ashen. She nearly collapsed at the foot of the ladder. Arthur was there in an instant. He said nothing. Words were inadequate for what he had just witnessed. Instead, he shrugged off his own heavy woolen coat, the one that still carried the faint, familiar scent of his pipe tobacco and cedar, and wrapped it around her shaking shoulders. He pulled her close, not in embrace, but in a gesture of profound, sheltering gratitude. His silence was more eloquent than any speech. His eyes, when she managed to meet them, filled with an awe that finally, completely, eclipsed all traces of his former skepticism. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the tamed fury of the mill, something elemental had passed between them, a recognition of courage, of sacrifice, of a spirit as strong and resilient as the prairie wind itself. The blizzard raged for 2 days, cocooning New Trenton in a world of white fury. Inside the Pendleton mill, however, a different kind of storm had passed. The main grinder, thanks to Ellie Vance's desperate courage and intuitive skill, held steady, its rhythm a defiant heartbeat against the elemental chaos outside. Arthur Pendleton's heavy woolen coat, still wrapped around Ellie's trembling shoulders as she sipped scalding coffee by the office stove, was a silent acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid in mere wages. He'd said little after her perilous descent, his usual gruffness replaced by a profound, watchful quiet, but the way his gaze kept returning to her, a complex mixture of awe, relief, and a dawning tenderness, spoke volumes. When the storm finally broke, revealing a landscape scoured clean and glittering under a hesitant sun, the townsfolk of New Trenton emerged changed. The near catastrophe, Ellie's undeniable heroism, and Arthur's quiet, unwavering faith in her during those critical moments had burned away much of the lingering prejudice. There were no more snide remarks from Henderson, who now looked at Ellie with a kind of sheepish respect. Mothers, whose children would have faced starvation had the mill failed, offered her shy smiles and small gifts of hoarded preserves or knitted mittens. Cal Munro and his accusations seemed a distant, petty squabble in the face of shared survival. He'd long since retreated to Junction City, his reputation in New Trenton as fractured as the counterfeit cog Ellie had discovered. A week later, Arthur called Ellie into his office. The room, usually so austere, felt different, warmer perhaps. On his scarred oak desk lay a long, felt-lined wooden case. He gestured towards it. "Vance." "Ellie, these are for you." She opened the case. Nestled inside, on a bed of deep blue velvet, was a complete set of gleaming, professional-grade mechanics tools, wrenches of every size, calipers, gauges, micrometers, each piece a testament to precision and quality. On the polished steel handle of the largest wrench, and engraved on a small brass plate on the case itself, were the words, E. Vance, Chief Mechanic, Pendleton Flour Mill. Ellie stared, speechless. Her own tools, her father's legacy, were worn, some mended, all imbued with memory. These were a new beginning. "Mr. Pendleton, Arthur, you've earned them 10 times over." "Ellie," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "This mill, this town, owes you. I owe you." He paused, then added, with a rare, almost shy smile, "Besides, a chief mechanic ought to have the best." The title, spoken so easily, so formally, settled around her like a mantle of earned respect. It wasn't just about fixing things anymore. It was about responsibility, about belonging. A subtle shift occurred in the daily rhythm of the mill. Ellie, with Arthur's quiet encouragement, began a new practice. Machines have personalities, too. You know, she'd said one morning, her gaze on the massive, newly overhauled sifting assembly. They work better if you treat them with a bit of consideration. Give them a name. Maybe Arthur, who once would have scoffed at such whimsy, found himself intrigued. A name, like a good horse, Ellie offered, or a ship, something strong, something that flies. Perhaps, and so, the sifter became Kestrel. For its quick, precise movements, the hulking grain elevator, always groaning under its load, was christened Hercules. One blustery afternoon, as they stood by the main air compressor, its powerful, rhythmic pulse filling the air, Arthur found himself saying, "This one, it has a certain fierceness, a dive from a great height. Let's call it the Falcon." Ellie looked up at him, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face, the first he'd seen in weeks that held no trace of weariness or sorrow. It transformed her, lighting her eyes, softening the determined set of her jaw. The sight caught Arthur unprepared, stirring a warmth deep within his chest that had little to do with the mill's steam-heated air. "The Falcon, it is," she agreed softly. Other, smaller changes followed, almost unnoticed, yet deeply significant. Arthur, observing Ellie's slight hesitation at the worn, uneven wooden steps leading to the mill floor, had them quietly rebuilt by the town carpenter, with a gentler rise and a sturdy handrail. He didn't mention it, he just did it. And each morning, when Ellie arrived as the first light touched the prairie, she'd find 2 mugs of coffee steaming on the corner of Arthur's desk. One black, for him, one with a spoonful of sugar. The way she sometimes took it when the chill was deep in her bones. It became their silent ritual, a shared moment of quiet communion before the day's clamor began. One quiet Sunday, Ellie took her father's old, broken wrench, the one that had failed him, from her tin box. She cleaned it carefully, then mounted it inside a simple wooden frame she'd constructed, beneath a piece of polished glass. Below it, in her neat, spidery script, she wrote a single line, a small flaw, never to be repeated. She hung it on the wall of her storeroom, a somber reminder, a quiet vow. It wasn't about blame, it was about vigilance, about the profound responsibility that came with understanding the power and the frailty of iron and steam. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came, it was with a rush of meltwater and the improbable greening of the Kansas prairie. The town council, which now included a grateful and somewhat humbled Mayor Thompson, called its first open meeting of the season in the newly repaired town hall. The scent of fresh lumber mingling with the promise of warmer days. Business was discussed. Plans were made. But before the meeting adjourned, Arthur Pendleton rose to his feet. His injured shoulder had healed, leaving only a slight stiffness, a reminder of the winter they had all endured. He stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the assembled townsfolk, a community that had faced division, sabotage, and the raw fury of nature, and had, somehow, emerged stronger. His eyes came to rest on Ellie, seated quietly near the back, her hands clasped in her lap. "Friends, neighbors," Arthur began, his voice clear and steady, carrying the weight of authority, but softened now with a new humility. "We've been through a hard winter, a winter that tested every one of us. This mill," he gestured vaguely towards the sturdy stone building that was the town's heart. "It's more than just stone and iron. It's our lifeblood, and no one," his voice deepened, "no one kept that heart beating through this winter like Ellie Vance." A murmur of assent went through the crowd. He let it settle, then continued. "When I hired her, some had their doubts. I had my own, Perhaps, but she proved us all wrong. She faced down danger, she outsmarted treachery, and she understood these machines in a way no one else could. From today, he declared, his gaze locking with Ellie's, she's no longer just our mechanic, or our female mechanic, as some might have said. Miss Ellie Vance is the backbone of this mill, and by extension, a backbone of New Trenton. And it's high time we all recognized it. A wave of applause filled the hall. Genuine and heartfelt, Ellie flushed slightly, but rose to her feet with her customary quiet dignity. When the clapping subsided, all eyes were on her. She looked at Arthur, a flicker of that rare, warm smile touching her lips, then addressed the expectant faces. Thank you, Mr. Pendleton, all of you. Her voice was soft, yet it carried a surprising resonance. I never thought of myself as lacking, or as different. I just knew what my father taught me. She paused, her gaze thoughtful, encompassing them all. Every machine, no matter how big or how small, complex or simple, needs the right gears, all working together, each one true. That's all I've ever tried to be. The right gear, in the right place, and in the quiet that followed, in the respectful silence of a town that had finally seen her true worth. Arthur Pendleton knew that Ellie Vance was far more than just the right gear. She was the skilled and steady hand that set all the other gears in motion, the quiet wisdom that understood the balance, the resilient spirit that had helped them all find their way home. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here.